Hi, everyone. I'm Valerie Scudney, and along with Nancy Toro, we lead the Somerset County chapter. So thank you all for joining us tonight for Sarah Jayne's presentation on integrating biodiversity and beauty, cultivating keystone plants with community acceptance. The presentation, as you heard, is being recorded, and it will appear on our chapter page and sent out in our newsletter as soon as it becomes available. Sarah has worked extensively with plants and wildlife for over 4 decades from California to the East Coast. She has a degree in agriculture and has owned and operated an organic farm market and nursery. Inspired by Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, Sarah transformed her approach to landscaping. Recognizing the pivotal role that each person can play in addressing the biodiversity crisis, she trials methods to manage ecological landscapes and enable people who may have limited resources and little or no gardening skills to encourage biodiversity ecosystems that support wildlife where they live. Her book, Nature's Action Guide, How to Support Biodiversity and Your Local Ecosystem, is a companion to Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, and it features 15 actions we urgently need to take to support biodiversity. Sarah lives in Oxford, Pennsylvania, surrounded by wildlife habitat. To find out more about Sarah, you can visit her website, and we'll put the link in the chat. Also in the chat will be a wonderful handout that Sarah has provided for your use. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Let's welcome Sarah.
Oops, let me go back one. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here with all of you to discuss this really important topic. So I'm going to get started. Globally, for most species, habitat loss caused by human activity is the greatest cause of species decline and extinction. The silver lining to this terrible state of affairs is that building wildlife habitat is something that you and I can do in whatever spaces we have. Today, we'll take a deep dive into some strategies for doing exactly that. On the left is a typical residential landscape in the US. For most homeowners, it's a big ask to transition their landscapes to ecologically rich plantings. As you may have experienced, filling a landscape with the right plants to support wildlife requires plant knowledge, gardening skills, and the ever so helpful resources of time and money. An ecological landscape is distinguished from traditional US landscapes by the presence of wildlife habitat. Anyone who has worked at maximizing the wildlife benefits of their landscape knows that it can get looking wild and messy really quickly. So on top of the needed gardening skills and resources, inviting the traditional US homeowner to plant for wildlife also requires that a new aesthetic be adopted to accommodate the more natural look. This is where we need to step in and make our ecological landscapes appealing to the broader public. It's no small task for us. Fortunately, there's some strategies which, when applied, make the task a lot easier. Plus, we have some allies in the effort. People sometimes joke that the monarch butterfly is a keystone species because it gets people motivated to do something about the dire biodiversity crisis. Although the monarch is not a keystone species, there's a word for species that represent a movement. Flagship species. Polar bears are the flagship species for climate change, and monarchs are a flagship species for pollinators. The international effort to save the monarch brings people into the fold. We'll be looking at strategies we can use to broaden the appeal for ecological landscapes. In Nature's Action Guide, I explain 15 actions that need to be taken if we're to preserve biodiversity for future generations. Note that this list is included in the handout. All 15 actions are essential for transforming our communities into functioning ecosystems. In this talk, I'll be focusing on the integration of 2 of these actions: planting keystone plants and building acceptance for nature's natural look. Plus, I'll be sprinkling in some topics from other actions. First, we need to look at some essential concepts that lay the foundation for ecological plantings. Likely you're familiar with some of these concepts, but some of you may be brand new to ecological gardening. So we'll start with keystone plants. Keystone species do a good job of supporting not only many caterpillars, but many pollinators, birds, and other animals. Over 90% of plant-eating insects are specialists, and some specialists require non-keystone plants and even rare plants. So we'll be looking at planting for specialists as well. With our plant choices in place, we'll then look at ways to help our biodiverse landscapes build community acceptance. And ecological planting can fit into an HOA-regulated neighborhood. We'll look at strategies that help us do that. Good design plays a central role in adding value for wildlife and building acceptance for natural plantings. Given that, we'll consider some aspects of design that can make it easier for gardeners with different skill levels and resources to add appeal to their ecological plantings. So let's get going. Fortunately for gardeners of all levels, keystone plants give us a solid starting point in this journey. In the 1960s, ecologist Robert Payne, inspired by the keystone rock in an arch, coined the term keystone species to describe the central role that certain species play within a functioning ecosystem. In the intertidal zones off the coast of Washington state, Payne identified the purple sea star as a keystone species because of its critical role in consuming mussels. Without the starfish controlling the mussel population, the populations of 25 other species were unable to compete with the mussels, and these populations drastically declined. There are many other examples of keystone species at all levels of the animal and plant kingdoms, from mycorrhizal fungi to saguaro cactus, from pollinators to leafcutter ants, and from beavers to the American alligator. An ecosystem is diminished without its keystone species. Since writing his seminal book, Bringing Nature Home, and continuing with Nature's Best Hope, Doug Tallamy has popularized the term keystone plants. Let's briefly review why certain plants are considered keystone plants. To survive, birds need thousands of insects to raise a single brood. Some birds, such as tree swallows, primarily feed their young flying insects, such as bees, flies, and wasps, and even an occasional dragonfly. But for many birds, including most songbirds, caterpillars are the top item on the baby food menu. Researchers Desiree Narango, Douglas Tallamy, and Kimberly Shropshire gathered data to determine which plants host the most caterpillars of different Lepidoptera species. Why is this data important? Plants are the foundation of the terrestrial food chain, and animals depend on them, but not just any plant will do. Like many animals, caterpillars require their specific host plants for survival, making them an ideal metric for identifying keystone plants. Narango, Tallamy, and Shropshire used the data they collected to identify superhosts. They called these productive plants keystone species. Oaks are the most important keystone genus in most counties in the US. In the Mid-Atlantic region, oaks host over 500 Lepidoptera species. It's interesting to note that keystone species usually aren't the most abundant species in an ecosystem. For example, here, hundreds of non-keystone spotted bee balm plants grow beneath a single keystone species tree. The term specialist is used to compare animals whose diets are limited with generalists who have a wide variety of food choices in their diet. Specialization is why choosing native plants matters. Specialization is also why the vast majority of our introduced plants although really beautiful in our landscapes, fail to support the full range of diversity of our local wildlife. Even when an introduced plant is abuzz with pollinators, the pollinators we're seeing are typically generalists, such as honeybees and bumblebees. If it weren't for specialization, we wouldn't have to spend as much time removing invasive plants, and we could all continue planting the thousands of stunningly gorgeous introduced plants. But specialization does exist in nature. For example, while the generalist bumblebee successfully forages on a wide variety of flowering plants, the red milkweed beetle only eats the flowers, leaves, and stems of milkweed species. Some caterpillars are generalists and can feed on many different plant species. For example, the caterpillar of the red-spotted purple butterfly feeds on a wide variety of deciduous trees, such as willow, apple, aspen, serviceberry, and black cherry, shown here. In contrast, most caterpillars are specialists. The selection of plant species they can feed on is limited. The snowberry clear-winged caterpillar, which is a daytime flying sphinx moth that looks like a tiny hummingbird, specializes on snowberry, along with dogbane and native honeysuckles. If their host plants aren't present, these caterpillars won't be present either. Please note that in the handout, I have included the scientific names of most of the plants I'll be mentioning. Researchers Loxdale, Ballig, and Harvey point out in a 2019 article in the journal Insects that the term generalist is a misnomer. These authors propose the use of polyphagy, oligophagy, and monophagy as more accurate terms to identify the range of a species' diet. This makes a lot of sense to me because specialization is solely a matter of degrees. We humans are generalists, although we may voluntarily specialize to some extent, think pescatarian, vegetarian, and vegan. Nevertheless, we can't consume plastic or even many organic materials such as cotton. Although the terms these authors suggest are more accurate, we do need to keep things simple or we'll lose all but the most dedicated ecological gardeners. And the term generalist is in general use, so it makes sense to keep on using it, while keeping in mind that, in reality, all animals are specialists to some degree. Now, just when we think we're starting to get a handle on all of this, consider the research that Desiree Narango is currently conducting related to the extent of regional specialization by insect species. It turns out that although a species may be considered a generalist, regional populations may specialize on a limited number of species. For example, the Luna moth has been observed to prefer oak and birch in Maine, and liquid amber, which you may know as sweet gum, is preferred in the Mid-Atlantic region. I share this idea not to complicate matters, but because it's interesting. For now, until we have solid data, we can keep it simple and keep on planting the host plants most associated with species. With all this in mind, let's look at how to choose plants for specialists. Ensuring that your wildlife habitat generously provides plants for specialists may sound like a daunting task, but some helpful tools make it pretty easy to do. First, we need to identify which plants will offer the greatest ecological value where we live. Later, we'll look at ways to procure them, even on a tight budget. We'll start with the obvious strategy: plant keystone species. If you're a brand new ecological gardener, you can't go wrong by choosing keystone plants. In addition to hosting many caterpillar specialists, keystone plants are a good source of nectar and pollen for specialist pollinators. Members of the keystone aster family, for example, are a magnet for pollinators, including some native pollen specialist bees, such as the longhorn bee shown here. It's now easy to identify the keystone plants for your ecoregion. Visit the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, a tool which Doug Tallamy helped to create. Simply search online for NWF Native Plant Finder enter your zip code, and click Find Native Plants. This link and others that I mentioned are listed in the handout. For example, for Duke Farms, the Native Plant Finder shows the top herbaceous genus is Solidago, which hosts 121 Lepidopterous species, and oak is the top woody genus, hosting a whopping 4 times that of Solidago. Although a lot of our gardening focuses on perennials, this makes a convincing argument for our focus on planting keystone trees and shrubs. Which leads us to the next strategy for planting for specialists: plant keystone trees and shrubs. The ecological benefits of woody plants need more attention. Consider the willow, for example. Aside from its erosion prevention superpowers, this genus supports an estimated 354 caterpillar species in the Duke Farms area, and it supports many types of generalist bees, along with some specialist bees, such as mining bees, like the one shown here. As you start to identify the plants you want to add to your wildlife habitat, it's a good idea to keep a list of the plants, including those that you already have growing on your property and those you'd like to acquire. I've included this blank plant list in the handouts. I've also included a link to my own Google spreadsheet, which has an extensive list of Mid-Atlantic region plants already loaded into it. You'll be able to make a copy if you want to and personalize it for your property. At this stage of planting, I like to jot down in the notes column why this plant would be beneficial to include. For example, say it hosts 297 Lepidopter species, or it's an early pollen source for specialist bees. If I don't make this note, I end up with a stack of seed packets needing stratification that I forgot why I just had to have. I found that filling out this native plant information sheet for each of the species I grow helps me to get to know the plants. Plus, I can record propagation dates and my experiences growing each species. So I've included this sheet in the handouts as well. The monarch caterpillar, with its dependence on milkweed, makes milkweed a perfect example of a plant that is not a keystone plant, but that critically needs to be planted if we're to prevent a species from going extinct. This illustrates the next strategy: plant for specialist butterflies and moths. For this, we need to know which keystone plants specific Lepidoptera species require, so that we know what to plant for the specific caterpillars we hope to attract. Just as we can use the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder to find out our keystone plants, we can use it to identify the host plants caterpillars specialize on. Only this time, we'll click on Find Butterflies. You can enter a butterfly you're curious about in the search bar at the top of the web page, or simply explore the Lepidopter profiles. The profiles are arranged by the specialists, the pickiest eaters first. The first 4 Lepidoptera shown here use only one genus as a host plant. Fortunately for them, these genera are not obscure rare plants, with Salix, Prunus, and Ulmus among the top 10 keystone genera for the Mid-Atlantic region. This demonstrates how keystone plants support many specialists, even very picky ones. You can click on the caterpillar profile for a list of its host genre. Then another super helpful feature here is that you can click on the plant genus profile for a list of species within this genus that are native to your local ecoregion. The advent of AI results on Google searches is a super fast way to get an idea of a butterfly's host plants. But be sure to click on the links for each search result to verify the reliability of the source. For example, enter the search terms yellow swallowtail host plant, and various resources come up identifying host plants, including tulip poplar, which you might know as the tulip tree. Considered a generalist, the eastern swallowtail feeds on a pretty wide selection of host plants, setting aside for now the question of its regional specializations. Caterpillars, native pollen specialist bees, cannot survive without the specific plants they specialize on. So, for more experienced ecological gardeners, Our next strategy is a worthy task: plant for native pollen specialist bees. Pollinator Partnership offers some helpful planning guides for selecting plants for pollinators. Definitely check out their eco-regional planning guide for your zip code. Not only is Solidago the top herbaceous keystone genus supporting caterpillars, but it's also at the top when it comes to supporting native pollen specialist bees in the eastern US. In fact, the top 4 genera for native pollen specialist bees are all keystone species. We need to make a concerted effort to include these in our landscapes. Some native pollen specialist bees require plants that are not keystone species. In fact, some may require species that are rare. So to further restore our native pollen specialist bee populations, we really need to seek out and plant these less common plants. Horticulturalist and conservationist Jared Fowler provides us with important plant lists that can help us find the plants needed to support native bee species diversity in the eastern US. Some of the plants on this list you likely already have in your garden: eastern bee balm, eastern redbud, eastern waterleaf, and foxglove beard tongue are just a few of the plants our native bees depend on. Jared's list is commendable because it also includes sources for hard-to-find plants. The list is organized by plant families. Click on S for direct links to the websites of seed sources, or T for sources of transplants, that is, plugs or pots. Before leaving this webpage, if you scroll way down, you'll come to a bullet list of plants that are not readily available for purchase, but that critically need to be planted for vulnerable native bee populations. We need to prioritize the propagation and planting of these plants, but seed and parent plants for these species are hard to find. If you're an experienced gardener, you might want to become part of an effort to propagate and plant these species. Keystone species also do a good job of supporting local bird populations, not just because they supply caterpillars, but also because many of them produce fruit and seeds. If you're a bird lover, you may wish to look into the specific plants that support your local birds. The National Audubon Society's Native Plant Database will help you find native plants that your local bird species depend upon for survival. Enter your zip code to generate a list of plants native to your region that include profiles of bird families that each plant may attract, information about the bird's range and habitat, and recordings of its song. There's another essential tool for help with selecting plants: the BONAP maps. These are the Biota of North America program maps developed by Dr. John Cartez. When you're considering purchasing a plant at a nursery, or you've identified an unfamiliar plant that's volunteered in your garden, you can use the BONAP maps to quickly determine the status of that plant in your county. Since many of you may have attended the Native Plant Society of New Jersey's statewide conference last March, I'll only briefly review the maps now. Then if you'd like to know more about them, ask me during Q&A and I'll explain them further. As you may recall, dark green indicates that this plant, red chokeberry, has been recorded in the state, but not in this county. Lime green indicates that the plant naturally occurs in this county. Keep in mind that the microhabitats within a county will determine which plants are found in specific locations in a county. For example, both a bog plant and a dryland plant might be color-coded lime green, but if your property's on a dry slope, the bog plant is obviously not an option. We've looked at keystone plants and plants for specialists, along with some tools to identify which species grow where you live. Including a variety of these plants in your gardens will increase the biodiversity of your landscape. To maximize the benefits wildlife will get from these plants, let's look at several logistical considerations when it comes to planting plants. Experienced gardeners may wish to explore the more specialized caterpillar host plant relationships to ensure that both nectar and host plants are present for a species. For example, the Pandora sphinx moth lays its eggs on members of the grape family, such as the native wild grapes and Virginia creeper, and even the invasive porcelain berry. The adult moth nectars on honeysuckle, milkweed, phlox, and other flowers. I found this adult sphinx moth in a shopping mall parking lot. It was barely alive. My guess is that it simply fell in exhaustion after flying around trying to find a source of nectar. Our intentional ecological plantings will help creatures to avoid this tragic fate. Get to know both the butterfly's preferred nectar plants and the caterpillar's host plant, and plant nectar plants near a species host plant. For example, skippers nectar on a variety of flowers, especially those with blue, pink, purple, red, and no other hues, including the purple coneflower shown here. Skipper caterpillars eat the leaves of grasses, reeds, and woody plants. So here we have a purple coneflower planted beside a clump of little blue stem grass, ideal for encouraging skipper populations. Where we plant keystone shrubs and trees, we need to plant caterpillar pupation sites underneath. These soft landings, as pollinator conservationist Heather Holm has descriptively dubbed them, need to extend out to the edge of the leaf canopy so that caterpillars can drop down and pupate in the leaf litter or soft ground beneath the tree. For a list of plants ideal for soft landings and to learn more about soft landings, visit Heather Holm's website. Jot this one down as it's not in the handout, pollinatorsnativeplants.com, or do an online search for Heather Holm soft landings. Get to know the foraging distances of your local pollinators so that you can strategically place plants to help optimize their foraging efficiency. For example, although bumblebees may travel up to 4.6 miles to forage, the small carpenter bee travels a mere 22 to 78 yards in search of nectar and pollen. Although it feeds on a wide range of flowers, asters, shown here, are a favorite. Thus, planting a mass of plants in the aster family allows these tiny bees to efficiently access enough food within their limited foraging range. Optimizing foraging distances is one of the goals of Pollinator Pathway. This program strives to connect properties into a continuous pathway for pollinators, richly planted with the nectar and pollen plants pollinators need. Using an average foraging distance of 820 yards, Pollinator Pathway aims to connect properties no farther apart than this. Their website offers a wealth of pollinator resources. Finally, in addition to leaving deadwood and bare ground for native bees and other animals to nest in, plant pithy and hollow stem plants for cavity nesting bees. You'll recognize many of these as being keystone plants. In fact, goldenrod, aster, sunflower, and Joe pieweed are the top 4 herbaceous keystone plants in the Mid-Atlantic region. Keeping these plant placement strategies in mind as you choose plants and edit your garden beds will maximize the benefits of the keystone plants in your landscape. We've looked at the plants we need to be planting to support biodiversity. Now let's look at how we can integrate the more natural look of a landscape in a way that fosters biodiversity and community acceptance. If we come from an ecological perspective, transitioning our landscapes to ecologically rich wildlife habitat may be an easier adjustment plant-wise, but can be more challenging when it comes to winning neighborhood acceptance. On the other hand, if we come from a plant-loving horticultural background, our gardening aesthetics are likely to result in attractive gardens that fit within neighborhood standards. But adjusting to a new plant palette and a more natural look can be tough challenges to embrace. We may face steep learning curves or have to give up some plants that we've loved. Fortunately, both perspectives can use the same strategies to build neighborhood acceptance. In 1995, Joan Nassauer, a professor at the University of Michigan, introduced the concepts of cues to care and orderly frames in her impactful paper titled Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. Cues to care are signs that a landscape's being cared for, and orderly frames are physical and conceptual frames that give order and definition to a landscape. Cues to care and orderly frames are efficient means to help a natural landscape be visually appealing and culturally acceptable. We'll look at both concepts. Let's start with cues to care. You might recognize this diagram if you have a copy of Nature's Action Guide. It shows the cues to care that help foster neighborhood acceptance. Keeping up with all the tasks that life demands of us is challenging. These cues to care are the easiest, most visible actions to take when the pressure to gain acceptance is high where you live. Just like a clean and tidy exterior helps build acceptance, so do a tidy mailbox area and a welcoming entrance. Surprisingly, despite the emphatic call to action to reduce our lawns, a small patch of mowed lawn is actually helpful in an ecological landscape, as it's a cue to care. It signals to your neighbors that you're actively maintaining your landscape, even if the surrounding landscape is more natural. Like a small lawn, tidy hedges and shrubs also show that your space is intentionally designed and being cared for. I find it intriguing that some of the most egregious failings when it comes to cues to care have nothing to do with gardening or wildlife at all, yet whether they're done or not done has a huge impact on neighborhood acceptance of a natural planting. In these photos, neither the plants nor animals carry any of the blame for this messy look. Unfortunately, even a tidy landscape won't garner acceptance if the buildings are dirty with piles of junk sitting around. But there are many cases where how we design or care for our plants does fail to provide cues to care. For example, by allowing plants to overtake a space designed for people. Believe it or not, there's supposed to be a pathway in the photo on the left. This is an extreme example of an unacceptable pathway. And even though I have a very good excuse, I'm not going to admit that that path is on my property. Not only does this path do nothing to build neighborhood acceptance, it completely lacks access for people with limited mobility, a subject that warrants an entire talk of its own. The photo on the right shows a welcoming pathway, inviting viewers to stroll about and admire the native plants. Along with other cues to care, keeping sidewalks and pathways clear and staking floppy plants or planting them in the back of the bed go a long way toward building acceptance. Now let's look at orderly frames. Here's a photo where the factors failing to foster acceptance are almost entirely related to plants and the way they're designed and cared for. We'll use this photo to discuss orderly frames. But first, do you notice the big opportunity to make this planting more ecologically beneficial? The branch at the top right of the photo is the clue. It shows that the leaf canopy of this tree extends out much farther than the current pupation site accommodates. By removing the lawn and extending the planted area out to the drip line, there's a greater likelihood of caterpillars successfully pupating. Regarding acceptance, there's several easy fixes in this landscape. A super quick partial fix is to do a better job of mowing. I really hate the potential for collateral damage when mowing. I can't bear the thought of a toad being unable to move away fast enough. So one cue to care that my property sometimes lacks is mowing. This is also my biggest motivator among all the very good reasons to reduce lawn. But when lawn is present and you live in a neighborhood where lawns rule supreme, timely mowing is an important cue to care. Mowing did tidy up this landscape, but it also made the messy edges stand out. This brings us to the next strategy to foster acceptance: the use of orderly frames. Surrounding the bed with crisp, clean edges is perhaps the fastest way to create an orderly frame. Admittedly, it's much more easily done in Photoshop, but edging with a string trimmer goes pretty quickly as well and gives some definition. Where crisper edges are needed, say in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, one of the most effective and economical approaches is to cut a sharp line around the edge of the bed with a shovel, removing wedge-shaped chunks of sod as you move around. This creates a defined edge with a small dip that looks tidier and discourages grass from growing into the bed. These edges, which act as orderly frames, can easily be moved outward as the tree's canopy of leaves expands outward. Another method for creating edges is to contrast lush growth with mowed lawn. The lawn serves as a calm contrast to a busy planting. This may require occasional string trimming, but it doesn't look bare like the string trimming example we just looked at. But like the string trimmed edge and the edge created with a shovel, this frame can be expanded as the tree canopy and the herbaceous planting underneath the tree creeps outward. Or you can define the edge of a planting by adding a physical border. Here, a log border defines the edge of the bed, but this look likely wouldn't fit into the aesthetics of the front yards of most neighborhoods. A stone border is a step up, but casually placed as these stones are, it will still fall short of the standards for many neighborhoods. To choose a border that will fit into your neighborhood, take a walk and check out what borders your traditionally landscaped neighbors are using, and consider using their approach if it appeals to you. If you have the resources, you might consider professional masonry work, but in that case, do be sure to put that border at the canopy of the leaves that you expect the tree to reach. The concept of orderly frames is not limited to actually framing a planting with a border, as we've looked at so far. Frames can take the form of a pathway, inviting viewers into a landscape. Patios or decks can provide a calm contrast, framing a natural planting. Archways can be an invitation to enter a different space in a landscape, or they might frame a view. It becomes clear that design of your landscape has a significant impact upon its appeal and community acceptance. Now we'll look at some design principles that work both for wildlife and people. Along with cues to care and orderly frames, design plays a central role in building acceptance for natural plantings. Design is also central to maximizing the ecological value of a landscape and its benefits to wildlife. Given that, it's helpful to consider a few aspects of design. It's also why in Nature's Action Guide, I recommend that new gardeners start with a bed in the backyard. This gives you the freedom to take some time to get to know the plants and develop a sense of design. When it comes to designing ecological plantings, it's helpful to observe many landscapes so that you can start to get a feel of what style of a design appeals to you. The design may vary from formally designed to wild and natural. Think about where your aesthetics fall along this continuum. Different areas of your property may call for different approaches. When it comes to building acceptance for a more natural look, formally designed and semi-designed approaches are more likely to be accepted in more traditional neighborhoods. The more rigid and HOA, the more formal the design requirements are likely to be. Mass 3 to 5 plants of the same species together. This gives a plant species visual presence and makes it more attractive to insects. For example, pollinators are more likely to visit flowers when there's at least a 3-foot by 3-foot mass of their preferred species. Here, heuchera in full bloom makes a lovely display. It would be less pleasing if the individual plants were randomly scattered across the space. Like the heuchera, groups of native iris add a lovely touch. Place plant groups randomly in an area to lend a natural feeling to the planting. At first, your budget may not permit planting multiples of the same species, but as you build up your parent plant collection, you'll be able to propagate multiples and refine your design. It's worth noting here that where deer pressure is high, landscape architect Larry Weiner has had success mixing deer's favorite plants in with more deer-resistant plants. In this meadow, designed and planted by Larry Weiner Landscape Associates, I'm always amazed by the plants that deer leave alone. This meadow is located just a stone's throw away from my gardens, where some of the same plants in my garden beds don't stand a chance against the deer. As with all these principles, you'll need to adapt them to your circumstances. A ground layer of native sedge, Carex species, or a creeping plant, such as the native strawberry shown here, is an essential component of an ecological landscape. A ground layer matrix serves as green mulch that protects the soil while also providing habitat and food resources to wildlife, including insects that make their homes in the surface stuff. A ground layer matrix also plays an important role in design. It serves as a backdrop, setting off a group of flowering plants and giving the eye a place to rest. Its ground-hugging height contrasts with the taller plants that give the landscape structure. A ground layer matrix visually unifies a planting in the same way that a steady beat in music unifies the varying melodies of a song. One of the most popular and ecological ground matrix plants is the native Carex, a keystone genus that supports 36 Lepidoptera species in the mid-Atlantic region. Note that the invasive and aggressive nut sedges that thrive in poorly drained sunny spots are not members of the Carex genus. Yellow nut sedge, Cyperus esculentus, is found on all continents and is native to much of the eastern half of the US, according to the BONAP maps, but it's noxious in the south and western coastal states. If you've ever enjoyed the beverage horchata de trufa in Spain or cuyo aya in Nigeria, you may be surprised that the main ingredient of these drinks, tiger nuts, are the nutlets from this nut sedge that you've probably weeded from your garden. Planting for a sequence of blooms is a double win. Pollinators get the nourishment they need to survive, and people are nourished by the beauty. For help choosing a sequence of blooms, the Pollinator Partnership provides handy native pollinator garden recipe cards. These plants are a good starting point for ensuring a sequence of blooms that appeal to both pollinators and people. Incorporating interesting features into your landscape design helps others to see that your landscape is intentional and cared for. Here, a false door gives intrigue to an otherwise imposing wall. Winter interest and a water feature provide visual appeal, along with colorful flowers. Removing lawn and replacing it with more natural plantings runs contrary to the prevailing landscape culture in the US, where foundation planting, pristine green lawns, and annual mulching is the norm. We humans are hardwired to perceive change as a threat. We can ease the worries of our less receptive family members and neighbors by making our landscape feel familiar and welcoming, by adding signage, leaving a patch of grass, providing seating, or planting pretty flowers. You notice pretty flowers always come up as a way to add appeal. A surefire way to build acceptance and lure people into the world of ecological landscaping is through edible plants. Vegetable and herb gardens can be a gateway to full-blown ecological gardening. The wide selection of tasty edible native plants provides a tempting invitation for neighbors and friends. Guiding visitors through an edible landscape is recommended to prevent intestinal mishaps, such as those that can occur by eating raw elderberries, which are quite toxic when raw. Find lists of edible native plants by searching online for edible native plants in your state. Also, on page 14.2 in Nature's Action Guide, there are directions for finding a handy table of edible landscape plants with value to pollinators from the Xerxes Society. I've also explained how to access this chart in the handout. Edible plant choices vary by ecoregion, of course. Use the BONAP maps and other resources mentioned to determine which edible plants are native to your local ecoregion. For a handy guide for when to start vegetable seeds based on your local last frost date, visit Margaret Roach's A Way to Garden website and search for when to start seed. Building a rich ecological landscape requires that we plant generously from ground to sky, but plants are expensive. For example, just the ground layer of a 4 by 10 foot bed planted in a 12 by 12 grid would require 30 plants. And even in the unlikely event that the average homeowner could find plugs of sedge for $2 each, that would cost $60. And that's just the ground layer of a small bed. That's why helping people to plant generously on a tight budget is such an important topic, because many households will not be able to afford to fill their landscapes to support biodiversity without some money-saving strategies. Let's look at some of these strategies. Many native plants are easy to grow from seed. This allows you to save your plant budget for the hard-to-propagate seeds. For $3 for a packet of seeds and a couple of dollars for seeding mix and some elbow grease, you can easily end up with 10 to 100 plugs of a species. To learn more about growing native plants from seed, I highly recommend watching the webinar by the Native Plant Society of New Jersey's very own Randy Eckel. I came across this too late to put in the handout, so please jot this title down. And if you haven't already, make sure to watch it. It's an easy way to propagate some plants that are more challenging to grow from seed. For instance, trees and shrubs, such as willow, dogwood, and buttonbush. Division is a much faster propagation method than seed to multiply grasses and sedges. These methods are also super economical. But keep in mind the very important point that whenever possible, growing plants from seed is a better choice when it comes to preserving genetic diversity. Buy one pot of a parent plant that's easy to propagate by seed, division, or cuttings. In future years, you'll be able to produce multiple plugs for pennies. For example, the native trumpet honeysuckle is a rampant grower that's quite easy to propagate by taking cuttings or layering. Consider planting an entire bed of parent plants for propagating. You'll have your very own native plant nursery. Just one suggestion, plant it in the backyard because the variation in color, foliage, and heights of a one of each species planting can lend a very chaotic look to a bed, although beautiful in the eyes of we ecological gardeners. Being able to spot seedlings of desired plants turns your landscape into a bountiful source of plants. Nature's nursery. At the seedling stage, plants are easy to transplant. A cost-conscious DIY approach to procuring native plants is so doable and needed that I dedicate an entire action chapter to it in Nature's Action Guide. If you don't have a copy of the book, or even if you do, please feel free to email me with any propagation questions. But now, we must move on to more strategies for making our landscapes appealing to both people and wildlife. Earlier, we saw how edges play an important role in creating orderly frames to garner acceptance. Edges also serve important ecological roles in nature. Let's take a deeper look at edges. Edges are useful in natural landscapes to organize plantings and give legibility to a planting, to make it understandable. Edges can be intentional, such as the edge around this garden bed. They also occur when paths or structural elements are present, as we saw earlier. Here, A repurposed concrete slab bench defines the edge of a native planting. In ecology, the edge or region between two habitats is called an ecotone. The intertidal zone we saw earlier is an example of an ecotone. Ecotones may be miles wide, such as for an estuary where fresh water from a river mixes with salt water from the ocean, or ecotones may be narrow, for example, where a meadow meets up with woods. A variety of edges occur in our landscapes and in nature, as illustrated in this diagram. Sharp, angular edges often occur in human landscapes and are characteristic of formal landscapes. Curved edges lend a more relaxed feel. The more natural an area, the more likely the edges will blur. Consider the edges on your property. Are there edges that you could further define for greater legibility? Are there edges you could make more interesting using one of these patterns? Where two different plant communities come together, edge habitat is formed. Some species, such as songbirds, typically live in the forest. Other species live in the meadow, and some, like the brown-headed cowbird, live in both habitats. Edge habitat is known for offering some of the richest biodiversity because the various species from each plant community intermingle. Deep woods are missing in areas of urban sprawl, and habitat fragmentation results in many small patches of habitat, or none at all. This leads to excessive edge habitat and, ironically, less biodiversity. A landscape such as the one shown here, even in its most densely planted areas, lacks a sufficient mass of trees to provide the deep woods habitat that many species require for survival. Excessive edge habitat leads to the proliferation of the native but brood parasitic brown-headed cowbird that lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, overburdening the host bird. This large cowbird egg that I spotted in a nest in my front yard prevented a successful brood of a native sparrow. Next, we'll look at how we can reduce excessive edge habitat by creating corridors. Connecting ecological plantings creates corridors. Corridors connect isolated animal populations, allowing different metapopulations to intermingle and reproduce. Creating corridors is also an opportunity to connect with neighbors and share the joys of wildlife with them, helping to foster acceptance for natural plantings. As we saw earlier, the Pollinator Pathway Program aims to connect plantings to benefit pollinators. Let's look at how we can incorporate corridors where we live. Where possible, connect the plantings on your own property. Here, the red stars in the diagram on the left show potential locations where homeowners could add to existing plantings on their own properties. For example, if you already have several trees, plant another tree nearby them rather than planting an isolated tree on the other side of your property. That is, if you're only going to plant one tree. Underneath the trees, encourage dense growth that includes shrubs and forbs. As you make plant choices, optimize your neighbor's plants by connecting your plantings with theirs. In this diagram, the red stars show additional ecological plantings situated near existing trees on neighboring properties. Yes, there is the ever-present risk that your neighbor may chop their trees down, but at least your trees will remain, and there will be corridors there in the meantime. Google Maps is a useful tool for identifying neighboring corridor potentials. The red stars show just a few of the many places where an ecological planting would help create a corridor in this neighborhood. Unfortunately, of course, not all neighbors will be inclined to help build corridors, but maybe over time they can be won over. Ideally, corridors are created at the community level. Wherever possible, the goal is to protect larger masses of natural plantings versus isolated plantings. Although small, is definitely better than none at all. Here's where participation in a program like Pollinator Pathway can help facilitate your efforts. The light green in the diagram on the right shows the potential for community-wide corridors. Another helpful resource is Conservation Corridor. Here you'll find examples of large corridor projects, such as those that allow wildlife safe passage over or under highways. They provide resources for large-scale conservation corridor projects that are beyond the scope of residential corridor building. But their teacher resources are informative for all ages, featuring topics such as how can we protect animals when their habitat changes? Finally, to build neighborhood acceptance, enjoy your wildlife habitat. Just as your shadow is the best fertilizer, as expert plants person, Ian Caton suggests, you being out in your yard, tending to your plants and wildlife habitat and enjoying your yard is one of the most effective ways to encourage neighborhood acceptance. As we work together to create ecological landscapes filled with native plants that support biodiversity, whether you are just starting out or leagues beyond, I'm so glad to be on this journey with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a phenomenal presentation. Such useful recommendations to support biodiversity in our local ecosystems. So we do have some questions, and I'm just going to go up to the top here. One of the questions was about the National Wildlife Foundation Native Plant Finder and the Audubon database. And the question relates to whether or not those databases include any information about the deer resistance of the native plants or the rabbit resistance of the native plants, just to aid in selection.
Oh, yes. Well, regarding those, the two resources, the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder and the Audubon Society's Bird Plant Finder, it's not exactly called that, but yes, both of those really are more of a list of the available plants as opposed to the growing requirements and whether they're deer resistant or not. So I wouldn't think of them as a resource for deer resistant planting choices. Instead, for planning for deer resistant plants, I would instead use, for instance, the Prairie Moon catalog. You can find out the deer resistance in their listings, and in other online nursery, check their listings because they often do include a deer resistant code on each of their species. And also Googling, or rather using your search, whichever search engine you want to use, for deer resistant plants in your zip code does come up with some good selections, though you can't really count on it because deer will often eat whatever they want. I know because I have Pacara aurea here, and the deer really don't touch it. And Doug Talmy is just right nearby, and the deer completely eat his. So it's, and that's a surefire one for many people that, is deer safe. So yeah, deer, a big challenge.
So what I'm hearing is there's opportunities to do additional research with regard to the plants you find in the database and deer resistance in another source.
Yes. And by the way, the plant lists that I give a link to, that my little plant list that I have online, I do, when I know for sure that a plant's resistant, or I've put down a symbol, there's a column for deer resistance in that list. So you might also find that. That's something that I really highly recommend doing, keeping a plant list and then recording whether or not it's deer resistant for you, or finding out from your neighbors what they're experiencing, although that wasn't very reliable for my situation with the deer pressure we have.
And that's perfect. Okay. So another question, I may buy 1, 3, or 5 plants, but my question is, how many plants make sense to plant in order to feed the hungry
Oh, that's a very thoughtful question about planting in mass for
Mhm.
caterpillars and also for the pollinators to recognize that a plant is there for them. When we plant a single plant amidst a lot of other plants, a pollinator might fly right on by and a butterfly might fly right on by. So yes, you want at least a mass of 3 feet by 3 feet. So for some plants, that might be 3 plants. For other small plants, that might be 5. So it does become expensive. So that's why building up to it and is one way to go. And growing from seed makes it very doable.
Okay, thank you. Another question has to do with the overwintering of bees in the stems of plants. And the question is whether they need damaged openings to get into the stem, or whether they can drill or use some other method to get into the stems themselves.
Mhm. Yeah. So when bees are looking for places to reproduce, there's several mechanisms. I mean, you'll notice sometimes you'll see holes along a stem where a bee or another creature has tunneled in and made their home there. But the deer browsing in nature does create the effect of pruned stems. So by pruning your stems high and waist high, I like to leave them at waist high if possible. Obviously, that doesn't work in an HOA community where the regulations are all in place, but then that does provide access for some of the insects, but some don't need that cut back. And the other thing, which is I think a very valid point related to this question, is when to cut these stems back. And the fact of the matter is that native bees come out at all different seasons. So ideally, if we didn't have to cut them back way low, it would be nice if we didn't do that at all. But when we have to do that, then you can cut them and hide them someplace, but do wait as long as possible. It has been proved, well, that used to be at 50 degrees, we could all cut back our stems. But that guidance was debunked within the past couple of years, that now that there isn't a magic date after which we can prune everything back and make everything looking neat and tidy, unfortunately.
Okay,
Yeah.
and making them look neat and tidy by putting some of those stems or stalks on the ground, they would still access them there as well, correct?
Yes, but I personally like to leave them stacked up a little bit
Mhm.
on the ground. I think they're more vulnerable. That would be something to take up with Heather Holm, because she would really know exactly the difference between on the ground or on upright. But I personally like to prop them up or kind of stack them, and also wait as I sort of push the envelope as far as what's possible, and I leave mine up a long time. Yes, permanently,
Okay.
kind of. Yeah.
Well, this may bring us into the next question, which is when and how should a pollinator or native plant garden bed be cleaned in the fall?
Yeah. It's, you know what I
Big
said about
question.
if we come from a horticultural plant loving background, it's hard for us to leave things looking wild. So that's where it's kind of a combination. We do need to adjust our aesthetics. Certainly, if you see the coneflower, the purple coneflowers, seed heads in the winter with snow on it, it's gorgeous. I mean, they're really pretty, or the river oats. So we can start appreciating winter interest, and that helps us not be quite as urgent to go in there and chop everything down and tidy everything up. But if we do need to do that, if you at that point, I personally like to leave the stems as high as I can stand to, which is 36 inches, or about what a deer would browse them off at. And then I actually leave some stems all the way tall, just because the birds will then land on them. But that fall cleanup, especially, you want to leave the leaves. That's fortunately become a very popular slogan. You want to leave the leaves. And if you need to put them sort of discreetly somewhere, or put them and let them mulch, create some lovely leaf mulch, that's one way to deal with an overabundance of leaves. But yeah, fall cleanup, I mean, look at it this way. It's less work. You get to relax a little more in the fall and enjoy the plants.
Okay, perfect. So we have another couple of questions that came in that are more specific to individuals' properties.
Hmm.
And one of those is we have some non-native Norway spruces that do provide wind protection for birds, but not much else. We have lots of other natives on the property, but I can't decide if we should remove the spruces or not. What would your advice be?
Well, I think this brings up a really good point. When we have trees that we have introduced plants, as long as they're not invasive, leaving them until we can either afford to or we want the space and are going to replace it with another plant. It makes sense to me ecologically to leave that plant in place because it is sequestering carbon, it's uh, preventing erosion, it's absorbing the rainwater, and it, in your case, is providing windbreak and habitat, shelter for animals. So if there's a time where you have an introduced plant and it's taking the place of plants and you have the time and resources to replace it with a native plant, that's an ideal time to take out an introduced species. But if it's not an invasive plant and it's there growing, then it's doing some good. Then it could stay there until it's needed for space. That to me makes more sense. That's certainly the approach I'm using on my property here is there's places where there's lawn still on my property, simply due because it's time and resources. You only can do so much. So I plan to change out all of that lawn before I take out the occasional tree that I inherited with the property. I didn't inherit the property, but I inherited the tree with the property. And I plan to leave those. And then at the point where I have more time and more resources, then those will come down and be replaced with native trees. As long as they aren't invasive. If they're invasive, it's horrible, but they have to come down. And I hate killing any plant, but that's where I draw the line.
Okay, which isn't the case with the Norway spruce. So I hope that advice was helpful. We have another question that's somewhat similar. This is a homeowner who is gradually transitioning away from a legacy privet hedge that they inherited on their property when they moved in 2020. So this individual has been slowly reducing it along with grass lawn and planting a wide range of native plants, but has has also noted that there are a few volunteer native oaks growing all the way up and through the hedge, including, and congratulations on this, a now 8 to 10 foot willow oak and an even larger 10 to 12 foot pin oak in another area. Any advice on whether to clear space around these native trees? Or since they grew through the dense privet hedge themselves, if he should just leave them there until the trunk is thick enough to protect it from deer and wind.
Mm. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Yeah, I would keep those there because the biggest challenge to getting oaks and other trees growing on our properties are deer. And that if that's how these two trees, oaks are surviving, and obviously they're doing fine. So yes, I would wait until the trunk is past the age of being destroyable by the deer males. Yeah. Wow, that's great though. It's a good
Yeah,
question.
that's good. Well, and that makes it easier, right?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
enjoy watching your native tree grow. Another question just came in. I have a giant old burning bush on my property that I want to get rid of. They've grown for many years into spruce trees that I won't take down. If I take out the burning bushes, it will be a gaping hole since it stopped growth of the spruce trees. What can you recommend I plant in front that will eventually fill the space?
Hmm.
I guess
Yeah.
it would be important to understand the location itself, the exposure to sun, moisture requirements and such. But do you have any general advice?
Yeah, well, first regarding a burning bush, definitely take that out as soon as possible. If it's doing anything like my neighbors is populating all over my property, little burning bushes, I would gladly go over in the middle of the night and sneak it down if I was that kind of person. But yeah, get that burning bush out of there. And then the shrubs that you might consider, it does totally depend on your location, but the Homegrown National Park has a handy shrub guide, and it's in their resources. I believe it's also Nature's Action Guide. I'm sure I put it in there. I don't know which page number off the hand right at the moment, but it's also, if you go to Homegrown National Park and you look in their resources, you'll see their tree and shrub planting guide, and that has some great recommendations for different ecoregions. And you could look at your ecoregion there and see one. I know that one that grows, I think the other thing you'd want to consider is one that grows fast, because you're going to be kind of probably at first go, ooh, you want something fast. And one that grows really fast, if you're anywhere in my ecoregion area, is the 9-bark. It fills out really fast, and surprisingly, it can be trimmed back to make a pretty thick hedge. It's kind of and it's a native, and it blooms and attracts a lot of pollinators. So that might be one to try, but you'd have to check to see if it worked in your situation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that those are all the questions. Oh, I'm seeing that individual indicated that the space with the burning bush is in the part shade. So hopefully your answer will be further elucidated in the Homegrown National Park Guide.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that should give some information. And then just, the other really great resource, or one of the other many great resources, is the Ladybird Johnson. They have can check all the growing conditions of different plants in that website. And do please feel, if there's anything I answered that you need more information on, let's see. Just please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions and help you out. That's, we got a big job ahead of us getting the biodiversity back on track. And I'd just be glad to, help out in any way that would help you out to encourage biodiversity where you live. That goes for everyone. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're seeing some folks congratulating you on a great presentation. So thank you so much for your presentation and your ideas. That's the feedback that's coming in now.
Well, thank you very
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Great. I'm
So,
so
I would just like to say thank you for everyone, Sarah, for sharing so much and for giving us all so much to think about.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's truly my
And
pleasure.
I want to thank Ellen also for handling the Q&A for us. And the questions, I want to thank the audience for those wonderful questions. They were really great. And as far as the handout, we're going to have our newsletter coming out very soon in the next couple of days, and there will be a link to the handout in that. So if you don't get it tonight, don't worry. You'll be getting it in the newsletter. Watch for the newsletter, because we want you to know what's happening next. And again, Sarah, thank you. You're giving us so much to think about and love about native plants.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here with me this evening. Let's keep on planting.
Exactly.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Goodbye,
you,
everyone.
Bye.